Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to some of you, and good evening to some of you. Today, we are very happy to be hosting Professor Ewa Luger, who holds a personal chair in human data interaction at the University of Edinburgh and is co-director of Bridging Responsible AI Divides, a National Arts and Humanities Research Council program embedding arts and humanities knowledge with AI innovation. Ewa regularly advises industry, government, and NGOs such as WEF, Microsoft, Samsung on responsible AI and is a member of the UK government's DCMS College of Experts. She also sits on the Leadership Council for the Future of Privacy Forum's Centre for Artificial Intelligence, advises Scottish Government and co-directs UOE's NLP Centre for Doctoral Training. Prior to Edinburgh, Ewa was a digital inclusion and skills expert in the UK third sector, a researcher at Microsoft, and a fellow at Corpus Christi College at the University of Cambridge. We are all very excited to listen to you today. Yeah, please go ahead.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Um, so I'm sure everybody's seen the abstract for the talk, but I'm Professor Ewa Luger, and I co-direct a program called BRAID. I'm based at the University of Edinburgh, as you've heard, and I'm going to tell you a bit about the program, which is really looking at the value of the arts and humanities to the development of AI, particularly responsible AI, which is the framing of the program. Ooh, I'm
Oro ko UK o woni debbo on ɗo.
Sorry, Abdullah, your mic is on, so I'm just going to mute you. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So I'm going to start by just an overview of where I think we are with AI. So of course I'm an academic. I can't help having some kind of definition of every term I talk about. But I think everybody kind of broadly agrees that when we talk about AI, it's tools, methods, and approaches that, typically would otherwise require human intelligence. But if you ask Google, it suggests something entirely different. And we know that public opinion around AI is full of concern, a level of negativity, some uncertainty, concerns over people losing their jobs, concerns over environmental impacts. And so it becomes something quite different than the tools and models and methods that we might think about when we think about AI in the social context. And this is a cartoon from like 2018, I think it was, when everybody was talking about blockchain in about the same way. So they were like, oh my God, it's going to change everything. And really, this when we talk about AI, this is quite often the cadence, right? This is the idea that there's a solution to every problem and it's AI shaped. And you're either for it or against it. It's creating this kind of polarized narrative, which is, especially over the last couple of months, increased quite dramatically, I think. But systems aren't just technical, they're socio-technical. That's the position that we come from within BRAID. And that's because they're shaped by human decisions. So we know that AI throughout its life cycle, right from like the data that you select to how you clean that data, to how you design and train the algorithm, to ultimately how you sort of stress test it and evaluate it, and the feedback that you use in order to iterate, all of that is the human processes and social processes. And so you can never think about this technology in a neutral way. And it's also embedded in social, political, and economic structures, never more so than it is right now, when governments are really pushing for AI to be absolutely embedded in everything. And of course, pretty much every product that you use now has an AI feature on it, whether you want it or not. The problem, though, is that it's an amplification system. So it's dragging all these biases and terrible behaviors from the past, like racism and sexism and anything else you can think of, right up into the present and making us deal with it all over again. But without the knowledge of whether those things are actually embedded in the systems that you engage with. So, we assume that everything is reflecting our current values, but then we realize through the actions of the system in the world that actually that's not the case. And sadly, these systems aren't inspectable. We all know that, people talk about AI as being a black box, and that's more the case, obviously, with large models and generative AI. But with the issues of transparency come issues of accountability. Like if you can't inspect the thing, you can't actually find out where the problems are arising from the outputs. And so it becomes this kind of area of concern that nobody really knows how to deal with. And whilst there are lots of smaller scale efforts to deal with specific issues like whack-a-mole, almost like bias and what have you, we don't really have a universal set of approaches or solutions to the problems that are arising, because you're constantly catching up with the latest model. And AI is kind of supported by this myth of uniqueness, right? So it's used in the marketing, the idea that, nothing like this has ever happened before. And we're seeing the people that own large tech companies building themselves bunkers. It's like the world is about to pivot on its axis, is the story that we're being told. And it's making, the public quite nervous. We run a survey, or rather the Ada Lovelace Institute run a survey that is has been funded by Braid this last year, and we'll have 2 further iterations, that is looking at public attitudes to AI in the UK. And we're seeing, concern about particularly these kinds of things. And you might argue that AI is actually designed for wealth extraction. So the only person making money out of AI is the person that owns the company. Like, nobody on the ground is making any money yet, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But we are all experiencing the social and environmental consequences. So the benefits are realized by a very small number of people, but the consequences are realized by pretty much everybody. And the less wealthy you are, the less well off, the more you're likely to experience those consequences, both globally and domestically. And also, it's just good to remember that technology is political. It's not developed outside of a political environment. It wouldn't be allowed to be developed if politicians were, politicians have their say in everything that occurs within a state. So it wouldn't be allowed to be developed if it was considered to be a universal harm. The fact that most governments consider it to be a good is what's allowing the kind of the rollout that we're seeing at the moment, and the fact that regulation can't keep up. But as like Marshall McLuhan said back in the day, technology is shaped by us, and then it shapes us, and AI is just the classic example of that happening in contemporary times. So the current state of play around artificial intelligence is there's massive investment. This data is from an MIT study that came out quite recently, that shows that there's been a huge amount of investment in the States, $30 to $40 billion in generative AI enterprise, right? That's colossal. But 95% of organizations are seeing zero return for that investment. And where there is return on investment, it's tiny. It's used for individual productivity. So these kind of like micro efficiencies, where you're trying to summarize a longer document, or create a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint presentation. It's not having the transformative and global effect that all the people that develop these systems tell us it's going to have. That simply isn't. It just isn't reality. We have no data to back that up, despite the fact that we've been investing in this for near on 10 years now. The only sectors that are seeing any advancements are the tech and media sectors, which of course you would expect, right? Because a lot of this technology is being embedded as a matter of course within those sectors. They're the only areas that are seeing major disruption or genuine disruption. And there's lots of indications that we're in an AI bubble, and that might burst. The Bank of England recently came out, very unusual for them to say anything that we were in an AI bubble, and for markets to that they may have an effect on markets, so to proceed with caution. And the valuation, we know the valuation of AI far outstrips its value or profit, not just from that report, but generally. There are no examples of value in any meaningful way when we talk about AI systems. There's lots of promise and transformative promise, but that hasn't been actualized. But there has, despite that, been a reorientation of government strategies. The only, I suppose, exclusion to this, there are countries that take more protectionist approaches. I know Canada does. I know Singapore has been very hard on the responsible agenda. They've pushed hard on that. But the European Union, or countries within the European Union, tend to be taking a more protectionist approach. So we're seeing more nations developing their own software, with specific guardrails developed in-house, keeping their data local. We're seeing more development of large language models, I suppose smaller scale large language models, to be used in national contexts, specifically where areas considered to be quite sensitive. The UK is taking a very different approach. We're signing contracts with large tech companies and opening our country to data centers and things like that. So there's a very different approach globally that's occurring. And of course, there are other countries that are taking other approaches too. And I wonder, this is just a personal reflection really, but whether ChatGPT is the next example of enshittification. I don't know if anybody's had a chance to read Cory Doctorow's recent book, but he's talked about this concept like for ages. So the idea that platforms, and by this the examples he gives are things like Twitter and Facebook, they start off by giving you something for free. It's like, oh, lovely free thing. We just want to help you connect with other people around the world, and we don't want anything back. And then once you're kind of locked in because you create your own value for this thing, then other things start happening in the background. So in the case of platforms like Amazon, for example, sellers were squeezed to allow this user experience to emerge and for users to have the greater value. And at the same time, sellers were locked in. And then in the sort of the final stages, all those positive user elements, the things that, like, not having to sign up for Amazon Prime, for example, before that was a thing, those positive user elements, the free components, they just disappear. And what happens is the value is extracted towards the shareholders and away from the user and away from the sellers. But by that point, everybody's tied into this really sort of, well, in his words, shit model that basically means that you can't get out of it. And if you do, there's a massive sunk cost. And if you think about ChatGPT, you could argue that's right at the early stages. So everything's free, it's great, use it for whatever you like. And then the next stage is, oh, sign in, just have an account. Or, we then will allow you the more advanced model and you can start doing more exciting things. And then the next stage is, oh, we'll just pay this little bit of money. And so this is how, companies like this sort of suck people into adopting these kinds of technologies. And that might not be a problem. You might think that the ultimate value for you as a user is worth it, but being mindful of it, I think, is quite important. So I'm going to move to talk about the program that I'm involved in, which responds to some of these things. And it's called BRAID, which stands for Bridging Responsible AI Divides. And it's about enabling a responsible AI ecosystem that embeds the arts and humanities. And it was written, the proposal was written in 2021, but we got the money in 2022. And it responded to a series of sort of ecosystem challenges that we saw at that time. So the first was that there was a fracturing or polarization of the ecosystem. So from 2016 onwards, you saw lots of responsible AI guidelines and rules and ethical principles, and all these things were emerging, and toolkits. And then more voices started entering the debate, and then eventually there was sort of disagreements, and there was less of kind of alignment. And at the same time, we saw this kind of misalignment of stakeholder incentives, where academics have a different set of incentives for doing their work, companies entirely different again, governments different again. And because of that, when we thought about responsibility, everybody had a slightly different cut through it. So there's this kind of sort of separation and fragmentation. Knowledge didn't flow very well between different domains and sectors. So the policy circles would speak to themselves, or trusted academic advisors. Academia largely spoke to itself, mostly from a sort of a back foot critical stance. And then we had large tech companies that obviously had their own view on it and were having their own responsibility teams doing work internally, and sometimes sharing that work externally, depending upon the organization, and sometimes not. But they tended not to speak to each other in any meaningful way. And there was also this kind of weak integration of sort of technical skills and humane strength. So like the humane disciplines and the technical disciplines really didn't come together in any meaningful way. And so you'd have ethics on one side and you have tech development on the other, and they really didn't meet in any sort of sensible place. And then we started also seeing this stalling of corporate investment in responsible AI. So where we used to have ethics teams and responsible AI teams, sort of about this time, they were being sacked and dismantled because there was much more of a push towards AI innovation, and it was considered that wasn't quite important. It was holding people back. The research wasn't useful. They weren't getting the value from it. But there was also this kind of growing need for responsible AI leadership. There was, the European Commission were moving towards having positions on this, but pretty much everybody else was like trying to catch up. So we designed BRAID in response to this, and it's, as I said, it stands for Bridging Responsible AI Divides, and it ran from November 2022 and is running until the beginning of 2029, although we are technically supposed to end at the end of 2028. It counts for £9 million worth of investment by Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is huge for that council. It's one of the lower funded councils in the UK. Plus, we secured leveraged funding of about 5 million. And we have two delivery partners. So one is the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is focusing on sort of responsible practice and responsible innovation. And then there's also the BBC, particularly BBC R&D, who are our other delivery partner. And it's led by myself, and my background is computer science, and Shannon Valler, who is a philosopher. So we're bridging that divide ourselves. We have some high-level objectives for the programme. So the first is bringing the arts and humanities knowledge more fully and centrally into that ecosystem. So how do we make sure that when this knowledge is being developed, it doesn't just speak to other academics from the same sector? How do we make sure that it really comes back in a meaningful way into that ecosystem and influences technological development? We wanted to build upon the lessons from the first wave of responsible AI innovation. So all that stuff that started building up from 2016 up until 2022 when we started the project, how do we make sure that we take that and we don't like reinvent the wheel or duplicate it, but we're really building on it in ways that are meaningful? We wanted to make sure that translational research was facilitated. So making sure that there's public engagement across sectoral boundaries, and that policy guidance was informed by the kind of research that was emerging around responsible AI, particularly the more niche research, which tended to be more in the equality sphere. We wanted to make sure that was really foregrounded rather than being on the back foot. And we wanted to bridge those community boundaries and really see if we could bring together a coherent community around these ideas. And then there was the need to foster more honest and equitable public conversations. And so this is something that we're really picking up in these 3 years going forward. And in the first 3 years, we were trying to develop community, give out funding. That was like one of our main objectives in the first 3 years as well. And so now we're moving to really trying to engage the public in discourses. We've actually started through a series of artist exhibitions, which I'll talk about in a bit. But we wanted to move beyond the notion of harm reduction as well. Like when we talk about AI and responsibility, it's often about sort of risk and harm and security in that more technical sense, and really doesn't think about human security and closer term harms. And we also wanted to widen access to responsible AI knowledge and practices across the UK and now internationally as well. Our second phase of our research is looking more broadly. We've just funded a programme of projects that will be announced in the next couple of weeks that are between the UK and the United States. At the time that we funded them, there was the department that we were working with in the United States was closed. So Arts and Humanities Research Council stepped in and funded that themselves. But it was a time when I think arts and humanities scholars in the United States were finding themselves in a very vulnerable position, particularly if they were not necessarily pro-AI. So why the arts and humanities? Why do we think it matters? Well, AI already impacts every part of human life, right? So, and the arts and humanities are fundamentally about human behavior and human engagement and the human condition. And so it makes sense that those two things will be connected. And building AI isn't just about coding, it's about understanding people. If you're a user experience researcher, you'll know this, obviously. A system is only as good as its ability to plug into its users. Otherwise, if nobody's using it, what is the point of it? So people being the center of these kinds of ideas means that you have to look to other disciplines to ensure that all of those connection points are met. And SHAPE products, and SHAPE stands for, I can't remember now. It's social sciences, humanities and arts for people and economy. So it's basically like the counterpart to STEM, which was the sort of science and technology side of things. But those disciplines, they help us critically examine and make sense of what it is to be human. And that's obviously incredibly important when we talk about any socio-technical context. And as I mentioned before, AI is a socio-technical project. It doesn't exist outside of human beings. And the humanities and social sciences and the arts are essential to building ethical, effective and socially aware AI. So if we think about pretty much anything in this space, how can you develop an LLM without linguists being involved or building on their research? How do you design a tool without designers? How do you think about sort of ethics and the moral life without philosophers? All these people are important. And whether technologists know or not, they have been influenced by these thinkers, even though right now some of the value isn't necessarily being observed or articulated well. And we've delivered quite a lot so far. So we've delivered 17 fellowships, 10 scoping projects, 3 demonstrators, an international call that's, I say, about to be announced, 7 artist commissions. We've conducted lots of internal research and skills development, loads of community building activities, and we try to disseminate and amplify the voices of the researchers that we funded. They're really only coming to the point where they're having things to say. Projects obviously taking quite a long time. Our fellows, for example, were between 12 and 18 months, and they're concluding soon, so they're really just starting to be able to talk about the work that they've done. And so we're really moving into communications mode over the next 3 years. And as it says there, jobs created and outputs and things like that. These are the kinds of statistics that we have to give to our funding body. We've got 17 active fellowships plus 7 more, which are funded alongside the British Academy in the UK. And those 7 fellows are also embedded in government departments. So we've done a really good job of, as you can see, if you can sort of see where all the different fellows are working, they're all partnered with very different people. So we've got somebody working with Serpentine Galleries, with Kew Gardens, with Diverse AI, which is sort of a not-for-profit looking at diversity in the context of AI and how it can be more embedded. The International Book Festival, Microsoft Research. There's so many different types of companies that we've managed to put fellows in, and they're all responding really positively and finding value in working very closely with academics. We try to be very flexible with our fellowships, so we wanted to make sure that there was space for the fellows to focus on things that they were interested in. So we had some academic-led fellowships, are often the case where you bring your own partner. But we also set up relationships with existing organisations and companies like Microsoft, where we worked with them to identify challenges they had and then kind of phrase them in such a way that arts and humanities scholars would be interested. I should point out all these are arts and humanities scholars. We don't fund anybody who doesn't fall into that category. So we also have 3 really big projects. So these are our demonstrators. They're all funded at just over £1 million each. And they are focused on 3 areas that we thought were particularly sort of important. Immersive art experiences is an area that was, this actually was one of those that we fund our first round. So we did some scoping projects where we were funding smaller scale sort of exploratory research, and then some of the hope that some of them would then apply for these larger projects. And the creating immersive art experiences did exactly that. So they developed a very strong proof of concept and then were successful in getting money to look more broadly at how you archive these kinds of immersive art experiences that are otherwise are lost, essentially, through the use of AI. We have a project about sustainability and environmental resilience, which is at Bath Spa. And so they're really just getting going now, but they're really interested in how we respond to some of those environmental challenges in a social way. What kind of governance tools can we put in place in order to ensure that we don't end up sort of selling off our future in order to achieve some of these short-term goals that we're currently being pushed towards. And then Equitable Futures for the Live Music Sector was looking at how you make sure that musicians essentially get paid fairly for performances and also for the use of their data with the development of these kinds of systems through blockchain, amongst other different types of methods. So there are 3 big projects and they're ongoing. They just started before the summer and they'll be running for another year or so. We also did 7 artist commissions. So the artist commissions were a bit unusual in that we wanted them to be public facing, but we also wanted them to critically respond to AI, but we didn't want to tell the artists what to do because they are creative practitioners. And so we left it very vague and very broad, and we just wanted them to respond to AI in ways that they felt were meaningful to them, but to explain that in their proposal. And then we selected them on the basis of a set of criteria that were important to Braid. We wanted to try and enrich and expand the responsible AI ecosystem. So trying to demonstrate, I guess, to some extent, the value of artists and the value of creative thought in thinking about some of these more gnarly questions when it comes to responsibility, like bias and representation and transparency and environmental issues. And we managed to get artists that spoke to all of these different things. I think that what they've done really well is demonstrate how art can critique and improve responsible AI, and we're seeing the work travel all over the place now. So we had our show in August. It ran alongside the Fringe, Edinburgh International Festival, and Edinburgh Fringe, and it was part of Edinburgh Art Festival. And we had a lot of footfall, lots of people came to see it, and we had lots of really positive responses from people just saying that they hadn't thought about AI in these kinds of ways, and for most people didn't really know what AI was before they walked through the door. And we had all kinds of things, from like really advanced developments where somebody was training a model, Rachel McLean, an artist that was training a model on her own image to show how these things are kind of distorted through process, to another group of artists who developed a zine that was meant to look at resistance, AI and resistance. So they were very much an analog project. And all of these different artists sat alongside each other within this exhibition. And we do feel that we were able to empower members of the public to better understand responsible AI development, which was, I think, instructive for us. You know, we had these hopes, but it did actually do what was intended. Not only that, people are inviting these commissions to travel now, and we're very excited for the artists. And we'll be doing something very similar in a couple of years, but more broadly, the call will be about creative practice, and not just art, but music and architecture and design, and you know, all these other disciplines that sit under the arts banner. But when we started out, so this is what the project looks like now, that's what we're doing. But when we started out, we wanted to understand the responsible AI landscape. And so we did a study to begin with. And it was intended to help us understand where we were with the responsible AI ecosystem. And it was just published last summer, this summer. So it maps all the different concepts of responsibility. This report is available online on the Braid website. And so it was like looking at the kind of the different communities and contested territories and that kind of a responsible AI landscape, discovering that responsible AI isn't one thing, it's multiple things, it's a massive ecosystem, and that the only way to think about it is an ecosystem now, because it's not a single thing or a series of things that you can very easily list in a kind of a neat way. It's much broader than that. It also offers a sort of a historical overview and an illustrated chronology of the origins and development of the ecosystem, and particularly looking at what the arts and humanities have contributed. And it concludes with 7 lessons learned from the first wave, which I'll cover in a minute. And it's authored by Fabio Tolan and Shannon Valla, and you can find that on the website, the Braid website. And there's the link to it if you're interested. So the way that they've defined responsible AI, the way we understand it within Braid, is that it's actually not a thing, but an interdisciplinary research agenda, or a stated governance ambition. So for example, interdisciplinary research agenda tends to reflect the way that academics think about it in large academic programs. If you are a company, it tends to be a stated governance ambition, something that you want to achieve. It's future looking. It could also be a label that you put on a desired type of AI product. So any systems, for example, that are looking at bias detection would be considered a responsible AI project. But it's also used to describe a broad community, or what we've described as an ecosystem of stakeholders that are kind of invested in these outcomes. And so is incredibly hard to define. But there were 7 lessons that we learned that we're taking forward into Braid 2. So the first is that responsible AI is elusive, and it's moving all the time, and it's moving because the technology is moving all the time, and because more people are joining the debate. So, you know, as society changes, so for example, discussions around gender have changed dramatically since 2016, and that's reflected in the kind of research that's emerging. But also there are other areas all responding to our kind of socio and political climate. Responsible AI really has to expand its reach to include the impact of communities. So there's not much in the way of participatory AI. There's not much in the way of drawing people into development of the systems that they're impacted by, or through that supporting their understanding, and that needs to change. We know that narrowly technical approaches to responsible AI don't work. So you can solve one tiny bit of one tiny problem, but if that's not connected with a variety of other disciplines and other solutions to broader technical problems, then it's not going to result in responsibility. You're really just hitting one problem as it rises and then the next. And so a community approach is really the only way that we're ever going to see any progress in this area. And it kind of runs counter to the way that we think about things, you know, as academics, but also more broadly within the industrial context. Competition is something that characterizes the ecosystem, in as much as people don't want to share their ideas in case somebody, you know, takes those ideas and builds on them until you've published it. And what that means is there's always a delay in knowledge. There's a delay in people exposing their research until it's almost a little bit dated. And so, you know, really we have to find ways for that not to be the case. I mean, I suppose the only exception to that, I suppose, is if you're very senior and you're not concerned about those ideas. But certainly when you're starting off career-wise, it's incredibly difficult. There's you know, point four, the fourth lesson is that we really need to be building public trust, and at the moment it's low, and there are no real mechanisms to build it. You know, the government is pushing forward, certainly in the UK, on developing AI and embedding it in everything, but it's not coming with any kind of concurrent development of trust or information that people really understand. And whilst that might be in the pipeline, like right now, we're seeing a trust deficit. Good intentions aren't enough for responsible AI. You really have to kind of dig in and get on with the work. And we've got to think more broadly than ethics and legality. When we've talked about responsibility in the past, that's often what people have lent into. So, you know, ethical frameworks, ethical guidelines, or what regulations say and what they should say. But actually, there are lots of different views and lots of different perspectives that allow us to think about these things in new ways that really, I think, help us to understand what responsibility is and means. And the last thing really to remember is responsible AI isn't really a problem to be solved, but an ecosystem to be built and sustained. And that's what we believe and we're trying to do. But I think there are also, you know, many projects globally that are doing this all over the place. And it would be great if we could all connect up and share our research and where we are with things and what needs to be done next. And I think we're still geographically siloed. Even though we might meet at conferences and have conversations and things, there's not much by way of kind of global academic connections. And obviously that's not helped by the current political climate. So when we're trying to embed these kinds of ideas into the AI ecosystem, we come up against a lot of barriers. And they're not unusual, but these are the things that we've discovered through our research. So the barriers that we face when we're trying to integrate arts and humanities knowledge in the AI ecosystem tend to be useful things. So there's a tech-centric culture in AI development that's really hard to push against. The notion that you would offer any other ways of thinking about things is highly problematic. Which means that we're either having to reframe our research in ways that speak to a technical community, and therefore we lose like some of the things that are considered to be important from the perspective of the arts and humanities disciplines, you know, or we end up trying to sell something in I suppose what you would describe as a different language, you know, people using different ideas and concepts that aren't familiar in a tech environment. And so that is an ongoing concern. And it's not just our project that's experiencing this. This is something that is, you know, I'm sure will be recognized by anybody. The funding priorities and market and industry pressures make this firstly like an incredibly fast moving environment. That the idea that you know, move fast and break things, which started off as a Facebook thing, but now I think it just defines the entire industry, is problematic when the research required to ensure that something is safe takes a really long time. So the two things, they run along different timelines, and industry pressures win out, right? So like whatever other research you're doing, you're constantly on the back foot, you're constantly trying to keep up. And then access to policy is also influenced by this. So policymakers are more likely to respond to and listen to voices that reflect the current ideology or line that the government is taking. So if your government is pro-AI, if you come in there and say, well, actually, I'm, you know, coming from a critical perspective, that's going to be a short conversation, right? So we're having to find ways to frame research that is meaningful and useful, but also speaks to communities in ways that don't put them off, I guess, you know, immediately a deterrent. And there's also the issue of funding priority. So if I'm certainly in the UK, I can speak to that context where we're seeing funding for arts and humanities and social sciences decreasing quite dramatically, and funding for physical sciences increasing. So the difference in what's funded and how many applications are successful is, you know, phenomenally different. And whilst those funding priorities remain in place, you're not really going to get the research that's required in order to be able to respond to some of the technical challenges that are being presented within society that are becoming societal challenges. There's also these kinds of misconceptions about arts, humanities, and social sciences knowledge as being sort of like soft and less rigorous, and because it doesn't fall into necessarily that kind of methodological orientation of an experiment. So disciplinarily, for myself, I studied international relations initially, and then I moved into computer science. So for me, the idea of an experiment is something that I was, it was kind of hard coded into me as an academic. And understanding there are different ways that knowledge is constructed and it's equally valid is something that requires a re-education. And that's fine if you're in an academic environment. If you're in an industry environment, that re-education doesn't happen and it's not needed. So it reinforces, if you like, those misconceptions. And because there's not a huge amount of collaboration, it also means that there's no way for those conversations to be had. And whilst we're trying to do that through programs like BRAID, and there's also RAI UK, which is another large program in the UK that's funded by the Physical Sciences Research Council, we're trying to make those connections. We're all still having to use the language of sort of technocentrism in order to gain any traction in the environment. And sometimes there is a feeling that might undermine some of the insights that would otherwise, be incredibly useful. There's also limited access to AI development spaces, and there's a level of tokenism. So being able to access AI development spaces is really important. For us to be able to comment on models and how they're designed, we need to be able to access those kinds of systems and places. And of course, a lot of the most, I suppose, advanced innovation is happening in labs in large companies, and getting access to that is quite difficult, and certainly difficult to get any knowledge out once you've gone in. And there's a level of tokenism in that you might bring an AI expert into a company, but that person really is just there to sort of focus on a few things, and whether that research and knowledge actually gets embedded in product is, really unlikely. I worked for a tech company in the past, and I know that getting any research we did in that kind of R&D space into product was like fleetingly rare. So you've got no hope if you don't work in the company. If you can't do it in R&D, like, well, how are you doing it anywhere else? So these are the kinds of barriers, but there's also a series of myths that limit responsibility. So the idea that technical innovation is social innovation is insane, but something that we hear quite a lot. The idea that technical innovation is just the shorthand for everybody's lives getting better, because we've seen the impact on the creative industries. They are, struggling for their livelihoods at the moment because a variety of different large language models free at the point of view, so making everybody an artist. So if you are an artist, if you are a designer, if you are a programmer, even now, you're finding it more difficult to justify your existence in certain contexts, and that will become more the case as these models advance. And there are no protections. The assumption is that there'll be some convergence and contraction, new jobs will arise, and sucks to be you have to reskill. And that's really what we're looking at, but on a much faster scale than we've seen in any sort of automations or revolutions in the past. And also, I suppose, it's never happened to middle class people in the past. That's something to bear in mind. I suppose we're all hearing it because the people who are being affected are already quite vocal within society and heard, whereas it's previously happened to working class people, it wasn't quite so visible. We can reliably predict what comes next is another myth. We all believe that we know what's coming next, but we were completely unprepared for generative AI. That was a shock, and all the things that came after it. I know from working on sort of technology for years that you'll do user studies and design fictions and all kinds of things, and all the stuff you think you knew is going to happen 3 years later is entirely disproved, maybe even 6 months later in some cases. Voice assistants being a classic example of that. So we really are rubbish at that. And if you don't know what comes next, then how can you possibly plan for it? Responsibility stalls innovation. That's something we hear all the time. But of course, we know that if you design something and you're gender blind, stuff results in harm. There's been lots of publications and research on this now, and this applies to all other groups within society, not just women. It's just there's more data around that. Or actually, there's less data, and that's kind of the point. There's a fear of missing out. So everybody's terrified that if they don't jump on the AI bandwagon, what the hell are they going to do, right? We saw this like historically, the use of smart screens in schools. It always reminds me of where the government in the UK paid for all schools to have a smart screen, and then we went to evaluate it 6 months later, and they were just in cupboards because nobody really needed the smart screen, like, or wanted it. They thought it was a good idea, but actually, once they'd used them, they realised that they were no better, in fact, often worse than the things they were already using. So innovation has to be useful, and we still don't know if it is, but we're pushing on it hard. There's the fantasy of sunk costs. So the idea that if you put a lot of money or time into something, then you have to put more, which any economist would tell you is mad, but that we still do that. I mean, that's something that's driving innovation, certainly with some of the companies that we work with. And then the myth that responsibility isn't a commercial practice, but we are seeing lots of small to medium-sized enterprises that are starting to make responsibility core to their work. And so we know that it actually is really important. And that size is not everything. So bigger models aren't always better, as we're seeing in across Europe. Smaller models are fit for purpose for lots of different things, but you've got to fit your technology to your goal, your endpoint, rather than taking the technology and then hoping that some use case arises. So what next for Braid? Well, we have a program of three, and I'm going to talk about one of these themes in a little bit of depth, but we have three themes essentially that we'll be looking at over the next 3 years. And they're aligned to, I guess, companies and areas that we have connections to, that we've developed over the first 3 years. So one is community and capability. So within that, we have the public attitude survey I've talked about. We're doing some work around capability, so skills, particularly young people with the BBC, but then also people who have had poor prior educational experiences and are otherwise marginalised as well. So there's 2 areas of skills work there. We're trying to create a stakeholder forum where we get the views of third sector organisations and just regular people, representative of just people on the street, looking at essentially what we're doing and some of the projects that are ongoing, in order to get their feedback and ensure that's reflected in what we do. And we've got a piece around social return on investment. So that's looking at whether there is genuine social return and value where AI is being used. So we're looking at journalism, and then a couple of other potential areas like education. There's actually a job that's being advertised at the moment for a postdoctoral research assistant that's 3 years working with us in Braid. So that's a live job right now, and it's open to international applicants if anybody's looking. Public media and democracy. So this is a strand that I'll talk about in a minute, so I won't cover it there. And then also recourse and repair. So one of the main things, areas of concern, is that while these things are rattling on, nobody really knows where the spaces are for recourse. Like, what do you do if you experience harm? And also, how does that harm then get repaired, and in what ways, and who's responsible? And so that's another area of research. So that's our focus for Braid. I'm calling it Braid 2, but it's not really. The next 3 years of Braid. So I'm going to talk a bit about a public media and democracy strand, which is the last piece. And I think it's probably go on for longer than 15 minutes, so I'm going to race through it. So the current climate that we find ourselves in is characterised by a series of different things, which is why we decided that this was a really important place for us to focus. We're also a partner with the BBC, but actually we have a series of fellows working in this space, working with different organisations like the Public Media Alliance. And what we're discovering is that there are a series of different issues in this environment that are affecting more than just, individuals. This is like a systemic issue, and one that's affecting democracies. So it's generative AI is reshaping all the domains that we are covering in the context of knowledge work. So education, journalism, scientific publishing. We've seen an increase in content pollution, so not just online, but also within scientific publications, some of which are being partially or fully generated, AI generated. I'm finding like reviews written by people of academic work are AI generated. You can still tell at the moment in some cases where people don't take a good edit through it to make sure it doesn't sound like an LLM generated it, but that will become less the case, and we're going to have content pollution, but no way of detecting it. There is some research and some work that the BBC and Adobe and others are doing about watermarking content, so that we know whether it is or not AI generated. But of course, everybody has to sign up to something like that for it to work. So studies have shown that there is lots of undisclosed AI generated content, and that it's much more widespread in academic and policy relevant fields than we previously thought. And now we're finding that publishers are starting to request authors to disclose the use of AI. And of course, that's happening in academic institutions as well. We're asking students to be, honest about when they're using AI, and there are guidelines developed around it. But it's really just a case of trust right now, because we have no way of knowing whether it's been used or not. And the thing is, we do have some AI detection tools that are developed, but they're easily circumvented. And because of the kind of the hacking culture, the computer science hacking culture, as soon as somebody creates a solution, somebody else finds it just as entertaining to try and disprove or make that solution fail, which is brilliant, if you're thinking about innovation in that, I guess, of ideas in that broader way, but in terms of its social impact is super problematic. We're also seeing this kind of manipulation and erosion of epistemic rights. So epistemic rights being the rights surrounding knowledge and our access to knowledge as citizens. So we're already seeing that AI generated content is shaping public opinion, and that the speed of AI innovation is making accountability very difficult in all fields. And this is threatening media integrity, but also it's eroding public trust. It's making people question what they see, or worse, not questioning what they see, where it's an otherwise trusted source. We're also seeing a weakening of content moderation. So, Meta ending its fact checking, X abandoning its policing around this areas, that there are companies that are allowing misinformation to flourish. And we are seeing more and more people expecting news to find them. So the news find me phenomenon, where essentially if it's not available to you on a platform, it doesn't exist. So that's how you find your news. You don't go to source necessarily. If you think about that model and the way that generative AI is developing content, you can see that as immediately problematic, because all of this, media is the cornerstone of a democratic system. If we don't have true or verifiable information, then it's a problem for us. I should say this comes from a publication that we wrote for the European Commission that'll be coming out in the fall, which is a wider thing about the social issues arising from AI. We're seeing some democratic backsliding, particularly in the United States, as everybody will have seen. Big tech platforms are controlling a lot of the infrastructure around use. And this is resulting in a level of media capture, which is, essentially the idea of ownership of the narrative. The thing that I mentioned before, the AI personalization of news, just reduces the access to diverse views, and it kind of undermines journalistic ethics, which is something that we had just taken as granted. We assume that it runs through all of journalism, but of course it doesn't unless you're actually a journalist. And it's also eroding some of our democratic norms. I've mentioned the news find me phenomenon, and then things like Google's AI summaries are kind of reinforcing this passive consumption, right? So there's this level of disintermediation, which is when there's a layer of mediation of information beyond the original source. So like a BBC News story appearing on Facebook, for example, is an example of disintermediation. And so people will skip original sources in favor of speed. And because generative AI is opaque and more often inaccurate than it's not, it poses risks to the integrity of news. And whilst there is still editorial oversight, there's a challenge to both that and to journalistic standards and ultimately audience trust. And some research from our lead on public media and democracy, Dr. Bronwyn Jones, found that the belief within the sort of public media sector is that generative AI is breaking the conventions and those kind of agreements that have emerged over time, like on the internet. So what you think the rules that have been developed through your interactions are just being broken by the way that generative AI and the platforms that use it are functioning. And that requires research, right? You need to understand what those rules are and how they're impacted and where they're broken in order to give people advice on how to become critical AI consumers. And it's also impacting the pluralistic news system because of the enhancement of kind of bubbles, which have always existed, but this is kind of doubling down on them and feeding misinformation into them. It's like rabble rousing more than it is anything else. And regulators currently aren't paying attention to the detail of evolving AI innovations. So the inferences made by the models with thinking much more like top level. And that's great, but actually lots of research needs to go into what happens at the point of the model spitting out information, and how does that influence people. But public media really needs to design these kind of appropriate mechanisms for value exchange if it's to continue in any form. And so we have a series of fellows that are working on this area. There's one, Professor Kate Wright, who is looking specifically at how generative AI and AI more broadly is being used in public media across the world. So she's working with countries and public media organizations globally to try and understand usage. And what she's finding is that people are super risk averse. So quite naturally, organizations can't afford to develop their own models. They are trying to keep things in-house as much as they can, but they're starting to lean into larger scale models that are owned externally by the big tech companies. And so that will be a problem at some point in the future. And we've had lots of positive feedback for Kate's work from the Public Media Alliance that she works with. This is just an example that we use when we talk to our funders, but I think it just shows that, so arts and humanities scholars, people that have backgrounds in journalism, those people are really helping to move the needle on how organizations in this space are thinking about artificial intelligence, and programs like Braid hopefully bring those people together in order to get us closer to positive outcomes. So I think we are achieving what we'd hoped to achieve. We've got Dr. Bahara Haravi, who's working with the BBC, and she's looking at enhancing AI literacy practices within news organisations specifically. So, of course, there are AI literacy issues internally, not just at the journalist level, but another all people involved in news production. And she's not reporting just yet. I think she's had an extension on her project, but is in the process of conducting her research. So hopefully we'll have some insights for her soon. Professor Nick Bryan-Kins, who's working with the BBC as well. He's a Braid-funded fellow, and he's looking at explainable generative AI in the BBC. So really just trying to help them implement XAI and everything that they're doing, because the BBC, like every other organisation, is thinking about how they use AI. They're much more risk averse and much slower in adoption than you would imagine, because obviously they're in a competitive media environment, but they're wanting to do this properly, essentially. And there's some positive feedback for Nick's work as well. So his work is actually being embedded in workflows within the BBC. So we're seeing, again, another arts and humanities scholar being really well embedded within the organisation that they're working. So I think I'm on time. So I'll just close by saying that innovation isn't just a technical challenge, it's a human one. And by integrating the disciplines that we are moving towards creating safer, fairer and more inclusive systems. We hope that we're creating more culturally and socially relevant applications. We're certainly getting a deeper understanding of human AI relationships. And we hope that by the end of the coming 3 years, we'll be able to influence better and more trustworthy products and services. But basically, if you understand people and their needs and values, you can build these kinds of systems that we might actually want. So there I am. Thank you very much for your time. I'll finish now and take any questions if anybody has anything that they want to ask.
Beautiful. Professor Luger, thank you so much.